Hello, everyone. As the inaugural director of the Elahé Umayyad Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto, I welcome you to the Institute's Iranian Studies book launch featuring Professor Rudi Matthee's recently published book, Angels Tapping at the Wine Shop's Door, A History of Alcohol in the Islamic World. Thank you, Professor Matthee, for accepting our invitation to visit Toronto. I also welcome Fariba Amini, a creative artist and the wife of Professor Matthee, who is joining us here today. At the outset, and before introducing our speaker, I would like to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge this land on which the Elahé Umayyad Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. It has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississauga of Credit River for thousands of years. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home to many Indigenous people across the Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, learn, and teach on their ancestral homeland. My distinguished colleague, Professor Maria Sabtelny, a historian of Iran, will be introducing Professor Matthee and will be also moderating today's session. Professor Sabtelny.
Thank you very much, Professor Tavakkoli. I'm talking into the microphone. Is this what I'm supposed to be doing?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Well, it's my great pleasure to welcome and to introduce Rudi. We know each other from our assistant professor days when we were both struggling and meeting at conferences. So it's really great to see you here again. I've forgotten all the times that you were here before the pandemic. But as you know, the pandemic just blurred everything for everybody. Professor Matthee is the John A. Monroe and Dorothy L. Monroe Chair of History at the University of Delaware. He is one of the great scholars of this generation. He is published so prolifically, author of 4 prize-winning monographs on Iranian history, and all of his covers are so original. You must have contributed to this. So this is one which I and my students have profited from. Persia in Crisis, Safavid Decline, and the Fall of Isfahan, because his works on the Qajar period. I'm going to hand it around. That was published by I.B. Taurus. This one, I think, kind of leads into your topic today and the topic of your most recent book, The Pursuit of Pleasure, Drugs and Stimulants in Iranian History from 1500 to 1900. And this was published by Princeton University Press, if I'm not. So this, I really enjoyed reading that book.
Okay.
And I should also mention that Professor Matthee is currently the president of the Persian Heritage Foundation, which is a foundation that publishes so many important books like the history of Iranian literature, Persian literature, for example. His book launched today, and you already know the title, Angels Tapping at the Wine Shop's Door, which I guess is an allusion to Hafiz, right? A History of Alcohol in the Islamic World, has already gotten some great reviews. I love the cover. Again, it's an early Timurid, or I should say late Timurid miniature of a court. And of course, the topic is of interest for all of us, I think. Alcohol, the drinking of alcohol, the role of alcohol in pre-Islamic Sasanian courtly society, and in fact, all through the Islamic period. And the use of wine and wine drinking and the wine cup are standard metaphors in Persian poetry, especially in poetry of the mystical variety. So I was reminded of my early days studying Arabic literature. And I remembered one of the poems that I read, and this must be like 25 years ago, by Ibn al-Farid, who died at the beginning of the 13th century. And the first line goes, "We drank upon the remembrance of the beloved, a wine with which we were drunken even before the vine was created." Now, there is a paradoxical statement, which I'm sure that you will be able to expand on and extrapolate all the way to early modern times. So, Professor Matthee, we leave the floor to you.
The story is... Thank you. The story is nothing if not filled with paradox, so I'll do my best. Well, thank you so much, Maria, an old friend and very good colleague of mine, for this wonderful introduction. And thank you to Mohammed and his team for inviting me, and of course to the Elahé, Omidyar, Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies, and the Canadian Society of Iranian Persian Studies, the University of Toronto, for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here. It's very enjoyable, and it's definitely an honor. So, well, let me mention and show the book beyond what's on the screen, and I'd like to pass it around because it's filled with nice pictures, and you get a sense of what it has to, you know, the way it presents itself, so to speak. So let me start with saying the obvious, and that is that alcohol has proven to be a juggernaut in human history. There is no society in recorded history that has been able to withstand its lure and its temptation. There have been attempts to resist it all over the place, and Islam is perhaps the most important force that has stood up against alcohol, has made a serious effort to resist it, and yet Islam too has been forced to make concessions to alcohol. One could argue that is one of the premises of the book. Now, there is kind of an inextricable connection between alcohol and Islam that goes way back, and that's exemplified in the fact that, for example, alcohol, the very word goes back to alcohol in Arabic, which means black eyeliner. The word booze in English most likely goes back to a word in Turkish and Arabic, al-buza, millet or malt-based alcoholic drink. Distillation goes back to the Middle East, presumably. Origin of hard liquor, of course, ascribed to Fakhreddin Razi, Iranian polymath. There's the Iranian lexicographer Muhammad ibn Yaqub al-Firuzabadi, who included 357 terms in reference to wine in his dictionary, which indicates something at least in terms of popularity or the ubiquitousness of alcohol, if not in the thinking, certainly in the practice of the Arab people. And then classical Arabic, interestingly, has more than 100 terms for wine. Has separate words for drinking in the late evening, al-ikhtibaq, drinking in the morning, al-istibah, drinking as early as possible in the morning, al-mubakara. There's a word for the midday drink, al-qayl, and at midnight swill it's called al-fahma, so go figure. I don't think there's any language that matches that. And yet, previous research before this book on Islam, on alcohol Islam, is rather limited. It's mostly confined to the investigation of poetry and art in general. Quite a bit of work on that, but not much beyond that. And there are a couple of reasons for this, I think. On the part of Western scholars, there is what I call a bit of a lazy supposition that since alcohol is banned in Islam, it's not really worth looking at it because it's largely absent from life, right? Islam is against alcohol. Muslims don't drink, so why investigate the whole issue? On the part of Muslims, quote-unquote Muslim scholars, it's a bit of a taboo subject since Islam rejects alcohol. You know, it's in the Quran, I'll come to that. So it doesn't exist, or at least it shouldn't exist. So again, no reason to really get into it and run the risk of being exposed for saying things that one shouldn't say. Now, the book that I wrote, which I think is the first, or I know is the first comprehensive treatment of alcohol in the Islamic world, does many things. It tries to be comprehensive up to a point, but there are a couple of things it doesn't do, and I'd like to point those out. It does not aim to be totally comprehensive. I don't get into Central Asia, either before or after the Russian intrusion. in part because the book is already long enough and I exceeded the word count already. I had to negotiate a little bit. Also a matter of competence a little bit. I read Russian, but it would have been a completely different sort of foray into an area I'm not totally familiar with. And there's also, more importantly, nothing east of India, Muslim India, because I felt completely out of my depth when it comes to, say, Indonesia and Malaysia and things like that. I also don't try, or at least I make an attempt not to sensationalize Muslim drinking by just highlighting excess, and there's a lot of that. Because ultimately, and I say this a number of times in the book, most Muslims never drank and still never drink. So I simply don't want to present this idea of that, it's forbidden, but everyone drinks. And then, tied in with that, I wanted to avoid the idea of reducing Muslim drinking to hypocrisy, which is kind of the easiest trap to fall into, right? They drink a lot, they claim not to drink, so it's just hypocritical. And then I also try to stay away from nostalgic view that drinking is tied up with, the Levant, the Maronites in Lebanon, the Armenians, Jews, Christians, and so forth. And that's a lost world, the lost world of the cosmopolitanism of Alexandria and Beirut and so forth. I talk about these things, but certainly not with a nostalgic view. Now, my approach to the whole thing has been, first of all, formed by my previous book, the one that you mentioned, Evolved Thinking About Alcohol Over Time. And then more specifically, there are two modern scholars that have inspired me. First of all, is Thomas Bauer, German Islam specialist, author of a study called Die Kultur der Ambiguität, eine andere Geschichte des Islams, which is now also being translated into English. And then the much lamented Shahab Ahmed, originally Pakistani, who died prematurely, 5-6 years ago or something like that, author of the celebrated book, What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic. And I'm sure most of you have seen, if not read that book. So here are the two covers of these books. Now, what do these say, these two scholars? Bauer argues that Islam is fluid, embraces paradox, ambiguity, beginning with the Quran itself. He also says that the notion of belief and practice in Islam are inextricably entwined, that Islam does not distinguish between church and state. That idea, he argues, is a relatively new one. It's kind of a trope for us, but it really emerged and originated in the 19th century. It's a product of the age of Western intrusion, as a result of which Islam has been Islamized ever since, first in Europe and then in the actual Muslim world, and whole parts of life in the Islamic world that used to be relatively secular have become sacralized in the process. So the Islam that comes to us now, mostly articulated by Muslims themselves, but also the way we look at it, is really a product of the 19th century. In part colonial intrusion, simply evolution of notions and ideas about content. Ahmed argues that Islam is whatever Muslims claim and show it to be in their words and actions. For him, Islam is interactive engagement with the pretext, the traditions that preceded Islam, the text, the Quran and the prophetic hadith, and the context, the entire, and I'm quoting him here, accumulated lexicon of means and meanings of Islam that has been historically generated and recorded up to any given moment. So, and he also said that if Islam appears to us as a dogmatic scriptural faith that rejects the distinction between the sacred and the profane, this is a modern interpretation. So he follows Bauer there, even though I don't think he consulted Bauer. The result of a defensive reaction to the intrusion of the arrogantly secularizing West, inculcated by the agents of modernity, colonial administrators, and Western scholars. So again, similar argument, slightly different perspective. Now the result in both their works is that Islam is malleable, seemingly contradictory qualities are not part of its cultural ambiance, but intrinsic to it, and these do nothing to make it lose its overarching cohesion and coherence. So an emphasis on the prescriptive dimension of Islam and the orthodoxy it preaches today misses the point, they argue, and obscures a rich tradition of transgression and defiance. And wine drinking then must count as Islamic because there has been, and this is again Ahmed, a mutually constitutive relationship between wine and Islam in history, quote unquote, by way of the ban that exists on it. So it sort of folds the paradox into itself. Now I agree with some of the premises. I think Islam is capacious and embraces contradiction, certainly in its pre or early modern manifestation. So Ibn Sina, Avicenna, must count as a good Muslim, even as he prescribes alcohol as a remedy for certain ailments and as a way to relax after long hours of study. But I also take issue with both of them in some ways. I think Bauer overstates his case to some extent. He contrasts a presumed pre-modern Islamic penchant for ambiguity and flexibility too starkly with what he sees as Western rigidity and an emphasis on linearity, which he sees mostly, of course, in Protestantism. And he draws his examples almost exclusively from the Arab world. He's, after all, an Arabist, and kind of disregards the Persian world, where arguably ambiguity and paradox is even stronger and deeper rooted than in the Arab world. We can argue about that, but that's my position. So Ahmed, too, I think, overstates his case because he ends up casting too wide a net, I think. He's too capacious when for example, when he says that, the word olé in Spanish bullfighting originates in the word Allah, and therefore it becomes an Islamic practice. He loses me. He goes too far. Because the whole idea of what is Islam completely loses its organizing, it's useful as an organizing principle. So I also argue that the dichotomy that exists in Islam between the religious and the secular is also not simply a function of Western categories, but is also built into Islam already in pre-colonial times. This idea of dino dunya, was there in many ways, sort of juxtaposed, before it was all tied up because theory had to match practice, which is precisely what modernity preaches, right? So that made it possible for things that are enjoyable, if religiously questionable, to enter the realm of the acceptable with the argument that they're beneficial, useful for human health and well-being, which is a powerful argument that comes out of Islam itself. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Now, let me step back and get into history a little bit for 10 minutes. It's not surprising that alcohol and Islam are entwined beyond the vocabulary that I already pointed out in the beginning, because after all, alcohol originates in the Middle East or in the geography where Islam emerged much later than wine did. Wine is presumably 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 years old, and we have found evidence for that in places like Georgia. Beer was first brewed in pharaonic times, long before Islam. Wine is integral to the Christian, Greek, Byzantine, Mediterranean tradition, and wine is, of course, ubiquitous in the pre-Islamic Iranian tradition, Achaemenids, Sasanians. And here, this visualizes the whole thing. This is where wine originates. It's the Middle East. Two images that proves the point. Wine vessels from Armenia, wine urn in the Georgian National Museum, thousands of years old. There's still winemaking in Georgia done the traditional way, with amphorae buried in the ground, grapes trampled by feet. Here's an image of wine being served at Persepolis. Now, let me get into Islam and wine, formally speaking. What does the Quran say? What does the Hadith say about wine or alcohol? But the object is really wine. It, meaning the Quran, discusses wine as a cautionary tale, as does the Bible, in a way. The Bible allows you to drink, but in a measured way. No overindulgence. Because, of course, overindulgence means a lack of discernment. You cannot pray, you cannot practice your religion properly if you're befuddled. So the Islam is, of course, as opposed to Christianity and Judaism, which kind of accept wine up to a point, ends up disapproving of alcohol, declares a ban. But it does arrive at this verdict in a circuitous way. There's no direct line. There's not one particular surah in the Quran that unequivocally condemns alcohol for all time in any kind of alcohol. There's sort of a progression or a sequence in the Quran that one can discern that scholars have distilled from the Quran. A trajectory, if you will. So we begin with Surah 16. Of course, Quran is not chronological, so 16 doesn't necessarily follow 2 and 5. But it begins with 16 in the sense that it confers a positive meaning on wine by hailing as a good nourishment, as one of God's special signs to the community of true believers. Wine is a gift of God, in a way, right? Muhibbat in Persian. And then we have Surah 2:219, is it Al-Baqarah, I think, the cow, which is the first warning about alcohol, the misuse of wine, insisting that wine's tendency to lead to sin is greater than its usefulness. So it's kind of, if not abrogates, it qualifies the earlier surah. And then we have, 446, which presumably came after the companions of the Prophet indulged in wine too much, and he ended up having a problem with his surroundings, right? That's kind of the historical reason for this. Admonishes believer not to engage in prayer in a state of drunkenness. And then finally we have 5:90-91, an outright call to avoidance, referring to wine and gambling as the work of Satan. Okay? But further ambiguity is built into it because that particular surah only talks about khamr, which means red wine. So it doesn't talk about alcohol. It's very specific, right? Red wine made from grapes. Now, what the Quran ends up doing is distinguishing between terrestrial wine, impure and to be avoided, just simply focus on khamr there, and heavenly wine, pure and divinely sanctioned, because it kind of relegates wine to the afterlife. It can be enjoyed, but not in this world. Only in the afterlife, where it can no longer disturb, social relations and the social order. So it kind of etherealizes wine, if you will. It brings it up to an ideal world without worries about corruption and decay, no harmfulness, blameworthiness. It can be enjoyed by men, certainly without harm or guilt. So very interesting. Again, it's filled with ambiguity. Then we have the hadith, which kind of puts a finer point in the Quran, mostly rejects it, sort of expands the limited pronouncements in the Quran with regard to wine, and mostly argues that any kind of alcohol is forbidden, with all kinds of examples, right? But even here, it's not category, and it's not totally conclusive, and you can sort of see through the hadith, if you start analyzing that after that during the Prophet's time, but also after him, the leaders of the community continue to have to grapple with drinking. Wine, in other words, didn't go away. So there's a continued struggle and trying to come to terms with this, because it simply proved to be too seductive to the community, as it has proven to be around the world in any time and any place. You look at, by comparison, pork was easily relegated to the forbidden because, pork it's not addictive, and it tastes good, but it's not as seductive as alcohol. There's no comparison. So it's easy to relegate it to something that, and Muslims follow suit, of course, because that's the last thing they give up. Wine, it's the first thing. If the last thing they give us pork, the first thing they tend to give up is alcohol. So, the fuqaha, the religious leaders, the exegetes continued to grapple with wine and ended up trying to find, come up with a definitive verdict, and ended up playing around with this idea of khamr being the only one explicitly forbidden. So does that mean that white wine is forbidden? Does that mean that wine or alcoholic beverages not produced from grapes are forbidden, from figs? From fruit, fermented fruit. So how does that work? Nabith is a very important phenomenon. It's a drink made from raisins and dates, mildly intoxicating. So is that forbidden? Is it about the substance, or is it about the effect, intoxication? So if you drink 5 drops or 1 glass and you're still fine, is that okay? So a whole plethora of circumstances and space within which to work, and that's exactly what Muslim scholars ended up doing. And so we have the 4 famous schools in Islam, the intellectual currents. The Hanafis, mostly widely distributed in the Turkic world, tend to be the most open-minded about it, arguing that some of them, at least, that nabith is allowed. There is even a hadith that the Prophet himself tasted it. They also played around with this idea of, how much can you drink before it becomes illegitimate and illicit. So as long as no smell is detected, it's okay. the last glass before intoxication enters is still permissible, and so forth. So loopholes, in other words, as is to be expected, in the absence of a clear-cut prohibition. Now, then throughout Islamic history, there have been other impulses that have sort of mitigated this prohibition, this ban on Islam. First of all, there's always been the tradition carried over from the Greeks that pronounced alcohol a medicine, medicinal properties. And Islam incorporated that. You look at Ibn Sina, for example, and he holds forth on that. It's a good medicine against all kinds of ailments. So it's good for your health. It kind of overrides the prohibition because it's not about getting drunk, right? It's salutary for you. Medicinal power, curative power. And that persists until today. My doctor made me prescribed alcohol for me. So I'm not a drunkard, but I'm a good Muslim, but I care for my health. Then a very important element is tawbah, or tawbah in Persian, repentance. Right? You can always repent. Sin is not inherent in Islam as it is in Christianity. It's walking away from God, but you can always come back. Right? Repent. Very much tied up with Islam historically with this idea of old age. You have to start repenting when the end is nigh. At age 40 or 50, you have to sort of make up a conduct sheet of your life. What have I done in life? And I should repent, and then I'm clean for the afterlife, so to speak. Right?
That's 90.
Well, it's moved up over time, but traditionally it was 40 or 50, and then it moved up to 60. So anyway, so this is also this sort of wistfully looking back on your past and when you were engaged in all kinds of, folly and, pleasures of drink and sex. Of course, it was something that the Arabs call al-buka al-shabab, crying over lost youth, right? And so you renege on Islam before it's too late. Now, very importantly too, the third of the four that I bring out in the book is that there's a very strongly developed notion of privacy in Islam, built into Islam. The sanctity of the inner home especially being sacrosanct, right? The Muhtasib was there, the police officer, the morality police, so to speak. He was there to check on public behavior. He wasn't there to check on what goes on behind closed doors. He wasn't supposed to knock on the door. It's a Quranically and religiously and legally underwritten rule. Al-Ghazali talks about it, for example. Private sphere is there to remain private. And then the fourth one, there's a class status involved, traditionally and historically speaking. There's a distinction between the khas and the am, or the khawas and the awam, the elite and the commoners. The elite are allowed to drink, not officially, but effectively, because they know how to hold their alcohol. They don't lose their comportment, their decorum by drinking. Whereas the rabble, common people, they lack the sophistication to handle their drinking. It's like 18th century arguments in Britain, the gin craze. The elite, of course, they drank too within their mansions, and they got drunk too, but, ordinary people would get, plastered and wreak havoc and create mayhem in public life. So for them, it was not a good thing, right? It's a similar thing. So, there was also this idea of ordinary folk are unable to restrain themselves, and they're kind of irredeemable anyway. In other words, it's mostly the middling classes in Islam throughout history that have tended to be the most abstemious and not engaged in drinking. So caliphs, sultans, shahs and khans and elites in general tended to drink with abandon, and there's plenty of evidence for that in the sources, beginning with Islamic sources, in an unapologetic way. Part of sophisticated court culture. And then, of course, we have the common people sneaking off to taverns, mostly run by Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians, depending on the locale. And so who ended up, meaning these minorities, being kind of the drug dealers, the ones supplying wine and alcohol in general, but also the lightning rods and the scapegoats. If anything went wrong, they bore the burden of the consequences. They were sought out as the culprits of the problem. So control and regulation was always there, but uneven, depending on the whim and the predisposition of the ruler, who typically, when he came to power, had to issue anti-Islamic, anti-alcoholic edicts, sort of in an incantatory way. And then, of course, the whole thing would dissipate, because it was simply sort of mandatory almost in order to establish its legitimacy, but effectively very little was done, if anything. And by and large, and this holds for all times in a way, there was generally little fuss about it as long as drinking did not spill out into the open, did not disturb the public order. That's, one truth that sort of holds through time. So we have a whole variety in terms of frequency and the sequential nature of anti-alcoholic decrees, mostly formulaic, episodic, temporary, running up against all kinds of, irrepressible urges, but also against interests, including vested interests, tax revenue being perhaps the most important, fiscal concerns. And then, of course, the ulama, the clerics, typically invade against alcohol, but manage to have their aversion to it translate into public policy oftentimes, but ultimately they had to bow to the secular will of governments, typically, who prevailed because they depended on these secular governments. There's a whole new impulse and influx of a different type of alcohol that comes with the Turks moving into the Islamic world, the turn of the millennium. The Turks bring from the steppes of Central Asia their own booze, kumis, for example, mare's milk, fermented mare's milk. But they also brought a completely unapologetic and natural tendency and attitude with them. For them, there was nothing untoward or problematic or illegitimate or illegal about it. They drank without guilt, indeed with bravado. Because they came as men on horseback, warriors. For them, alcohol was a means to socialize, a Männerbund, a band of warriors together. Before and after battle, you drink, you get drunk. And so they introduced that part into the Middle East. They also, as a reaction to that, introduced a whole new genre of literature, the so-called Mirror of Princes literature, the Qabusname, the Siyasatname, which are basically guidebooks, morality tales, training these Turkic invaders and sort of inculcating into them Persian manners, sophistication. And that included how to, deal with your women and how to send out spies to stay on the throne in the face of conspiracies, but also table manners. And that included drinking as well, how to drink and how much to drink and how to deal with your sort of, your drinking sessions and so forth. It was meant to civilize the so-called rustic Turks. So you see that appear exactly at that period. Now, a couple of examples, and I have to skip more than I can conclude, of course, because that's inherent in the topic. A couple of major rulers who are known to be booze hounds. First of all, Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty, whose habits are well known because, of course, he wrote about it voluminously in his famous autobiography. Here is seen on horseback, drunk. He famously declared only Saturdays, Sundays, and Tuesdays as legitimate drinking days, as days of abstention. And Wednesdays? What's the other day? Mondays and Wednesdays as drinking days. The other days he reserved for other types of drugs, ma'jun, the opium concoction. Here we have Shah Ismail, famously, of course, notorious drinker, died from excessive drinking in 1524, the founder of the Safavid state. We have the Selim II, famous sultan of the Ottoman Empire, who was nicknamed Mest, drunkard, who is known to have said, "I think only of the pleasures of today, for tomorrow I care nothing." And he also drank voluminously and died from liver cirrhosis. Here we have Sultan Ibrahim the Mad, who did not allow alcohol to be consumed in public, yet indulged in brutal excess in private. He went around Istanbul, killing those he found drinking and drinking coffee and smoking and drinking alcohol. And here we have Mahmud II. We'll come back to him because he stands at the threshold of modernity in the Ottoman Empire, early 19th century, who also died from a delirium tremens. So there are only a few examples of a plethora of rulers who are known to have drunk to excess in Islamic history. Here we have a meeting of Shah Abbas, as rendered in the Chehel Sutun, giving a banquet for a visiting Uzbek ruler, and there's a great deal of merriment, including the drinking of wine. Here we have the most explicit manifestation of how drinking and Islam can go together, because it's a coin named after and inscribed with the effigy of Jahangir, the wine cup, famous in the British Museum. He too was a heavy drinker. His wife Nur Sultan prevailed upon him to quaff no more than 9 cupfuls each time, and handed to him by her. Here's an image of an Ottoman Empire, a tavern. There were lots of taverns in Istanbul, mostly in the Christian parts, in Galata and in Pera, north of the Golden Horn. And that brings me to Islam, to alcohol in culture and in literature. And I'm going to skip that because for sake of time. There's a whole chapter in the book about it, and it's a whole extremely rich topic, of course. Let me sum it up by basically bringing out what's on the screen here, because it's the full expression of the fullness of the presence of alcohol in Islam, and oftentimes to a shocking degree in its openness, including showing drunkenness. Wine is integral to the world of Islamic art, both as a substance and as a metaphor, usually discussed and analyzed as a metaphor, but it's very clear that those who wrote about it, either Sufis or literateurs in general, are oftentimes heavy drinkers themselves. There's a whole genre for the khamriya in Arabic, which is known as the saqinome in Persian. It's a wine poem, right? So wine in mystical poetry represents joy and happiness. It's a symbol of the evanescent joys, an antidote to the terrifying truth of our own brief existence and the inevitable end. So live it up before you die, that kind of thing. It symbolizes the beauty of the world in its entirety as gifted to us by God. So wine is included in creation, so it cannot be bad if God created it for us and to enjoy. And it also, of course, represents transgressiveness and contrariness, because it is, after all, formally forbidden in some shape or form in Islam. So it's also meant as a vehicle for resistance, rebellion, both against the cant and the hypocrisy of the clerics, but in general, even against Islam, and sort of crying out to God, why did you create this and yet forbid it for us to use and enjoy? So just a couple of images, and again, I'm skipping a whole world there. Shah Abbas with a page surrounded by wine. There's a homosocial, homoerotic element involved, which is also part and parcel of wine in Islam in this particular period, and especially, again, in the Persianate tradition. And again, I'll leave it at that. Here is a very interesting image from the Zan period, or the early, it's actually early Qajar period. A woman holding a glass of wine, early 19th century. It also sort of speaks for itself in the imagery that is conveyed here. And then, of course, this brings us to the modern period. Khomeini, the creator of the Islamic Republic, who wrote wine poetry in his youth. Well, Khomeini, yes, I will leave it up to you because again, I don't want to run out of time. This brings me to the modern period. It's the third part of what I wanted to talk about very briefly. Another 10 minutes, if I have 10 minutes, and please me if I do. And I've already alluded to this. There is transformative change in the 19th century. Islam, or the Islamic world, is sort of introduced to modernity under all kinds of influences and forces and factors, right? It has to do with increased contact with the West, quite frankly, especially when it comes to alcohol. New types of alcohol are introduced in new ways. There's a colonial element involved, opening up of markets forcibly. The Treaty of Balta Limani, for example, 1838, gives the British and their clients the right to open up alcohol enterprises in Istanbul, in the Muslim parts, not simply in the Christian parts, things of that nature. The French move into Algeria, very important, direct colonial intrusion with all kinds of consequences. There's military assault and occupation. Begins again with the French, or actually with Napoleon in Egypt, 1790s, and the French, 1830. Then we have the Crimean War, 1850s, that brings for the first time foreign soldiers to Istanbul since 1453, and it goes on from there. 1882, Egypt, and you know the history, right? And with all that, soldiers are hard-drinking individuals, so they bring their alcohol with them. And it creates tension and friction and reaction and so forth. So, but it also brings the upper classes sort of gravitating towards alcohol, right? The new types of alcohol, chic, sophisticated alcohol, champagne, for example, right? And you see this in the capitals, first of all, especially in Istanbul and in Cairo, the first ones to be affected by all of this. Later in Iran. Iran is a bit later when it comes to many of these things. Different types of wine, sort of French wines, Bordeaux. Nasruddin Shah, for example, drinks 3 glasses of Bordeaux. So it's far away from the sort of the open air bacchanal that used to characterize the drinking of the Qizelbarj, say. He drinks 3 glasses of Bordeaux. And he drinks a little bit before executions that he has to watch to calm his nerves, that type of thing. So we're a world away from traditional drinking. Champagne becomes modern, quintessentially bound up with modernity, really, and sophistication. And so we get people who gravitate to that. And we have a class of people, and that, of course, goes back to tradition, to say the Hafizes of this world, who openly cry out against the hypocrisy and the oppressiveness of Islam as represented by the clergy. So people who begin to flout the rules by flaunting their modernity. I drink because, I don't care at all about religion. That becomes more prominent in the 19th century. So that, to come back to the point, a term has been coined, alco-imperialism, meaning alcohol coming with foreigners and being sort of imposed. I take issue with the terms, or I qualify it at least, because I argue that yes, there is imposition and there is force involved, and there are the capitulations, and definitely in French North Africa there's clear imposition, right? But it's not simply imposed, because there is also demand. Supply and demand are interactive. And you can't simply blame people for consuming a lot of sugar because sugar is available. You can say no, right? Especially if it's forbidden in your religion. What keeps you from keeping away from it? So if you then gravitate to it with a vengeance, then who's to blame, in other words? Maybe an open question, but at least it should be posed as a question. And I'll leave it at that. So, it's interesting, depending on condition and context, alcohol in the 19th century becomes either more public or more private. And there are 2 very stark contrasting examples. Mahmud II, I already mentioned him, ends up coming out of his palace. He's the first sultan to sort of show himself in public. He goes on boat rides on the Bosporus. He goes to some of the receptions given by foreign legations. He doesn't drink, certainly not in public. He does drink a lot, but always in private. But he begins to show. He becomes visible, There are effigies made of him, paintings, coins, not coins, but seals, with this image and so forth. And with him, the elite come out, and they begin to drink in public, at these receptions. By contrast, in Iran, where drinking had always been much more out in the open and in a way accepted, and many reports that Iranians drink much more than the Turks. They don't care as much about their religion, right? Mm-hmm. But in the early 19th century, Fatali Shah Qajar, who of course lacks legitimacy, the kind of legitimacy that the Safavids had, having introduced Shia Islam. The Qajars are an upstart dynasty. They have to establish a legitimacy. Fatali Shah retreats into the palace, and so do his successors. And there's drinking. It's not that clear how much in the case of Fatali Shah. He wrote wine poetry, so he probably drank, but the reports aren't all that good. In part because he retreats into the palace, so the reports, because of that, are not that clear-cut. But, he no longer participates in sort of the open air shindigs. Ceremoniously he ends up overseeing an Arsh festival, distributing Arsh to the poor people. That's his sort of public appearance. So a very interesting contrast. So the 19th century is when Islam in its modern manifestation comes in. And so we have a completely new approach that sort of intrudes at that time, because rather than simply a moralistic rejection of alcohol by, say, the clerical classes, now Islam becomes subject to a whole discourse that ultimately is based on the idea of health and hygiene. which of course is also a function of Western influence. You know, you look at France, late 19th century, there's a great clamor on the part of doctors, physicians, psychologists, and so forth, psychiatrists, lamenting the role alcohol plays in creating degeneracy and the loss of values and the destruction of the family, and all that becomes part and parcel ultimately of discourse in the Islamic world as well. So it's no longer admonition, exhortation, and also condemnation is no longer simply invoked on the basis of religious morality, but increasingly articulated in terms of health and hygiene. And so in the process, and now we're talking a process that lasts until today, the Sufi kind of approach to alcohol as perhaps forbidden, but ubiquitous and perhaps acceptable in all kinds of venues, is marginalized. It disappears from poetry and painting to a large extent. Sort of this irreverent idea of talking about it fades, and all the material is marginalized, in some cases censored, relegated to oblivion. And so this whole this idea of alcohol becoming a social problem and a drain on the social fabric and the body politics begins to prevail in Muslim societies. Minorities who have always been the purveyors of alcohol now become easy scapegoats, targeted as profiteers, handmaidens of foreign interests. In the case of the Ottoman Empire, Armenians, Greeks, and so forth, a fifth column. And so nationalism, of course, becomes part and parcel of the discourse. So again, minorities are oftentimes targeted as not belonging to the nation, in part because they create circumstances that sap the vitality of the nation. And ultimately, we also have even a tendency to accuse the West of deliberately introducing alcohol and distributing it in order to destroy the fiber of Islamic society. Even, say, Bourguiba in Tunisia articulated that, for example. You know, heavily secular founder of the modern state of Tunisia. Now, let me skip this because I've already talked about it. This is basically summing up, and I think I've run out of time. So let me just end with a number of rather random pictures, some of which are also in the book, that show you some of the manifestations of how alcohol presents itself in modern society, without comment. And if you want to talk about it or raise questions about it, I'll be happy to bring them up again. This is, by the way, the Bomonti. I'll make some comments. They introduced beer into the Ottoman Empire, late 18th, 19th century. They created the Bomonti factory, which until recently was destroyed a couple of years ago, was the pioneer of beer production in the Ottoman Empire. Russians coming to Ottoman Empire in the wake of World War I, tens of thousands introduced alcoholic practice into Istanbul with all kinds of very interesting consequences. We have the idea of, female waitresses, shocking and revolutionary in the early Turkish Republic. We have an indigenous temperance movement in the Ottoman Empire, the Elahé movement, the Green Moon movement, which is still in existence, played an important role in a prohibition, American-style prohibition that briefly existed in 1920. We have, of course, Atatürk, who is synonymous with raki, Turkish alcoholic drink, as sort of emblematic of his new republic, secular. And then we have advertisements in Turkey and Republican Turkey for beer, especially indigenous beer, because there was also an import substitution element involved here. Beer advertisement 2013. And then, of course, we have the Turkey of Erdogan, which is basically a culture war against alcohol, synonymous with debauchery and the destruction of the family and social values and so forth, who propagated Iran as the national drink as opposed to raki, which had been propagated by Atatürk. And of course, a backlash against that during the Gezi uprising in 2013. Cheers Tayyip Erdogan, Pakistan, again, a whole story behind it. I won't get into this, but Yahya Khan, one of the presidents who drank presumably one whole bottle of whiskey a day. And then, of course, I love this. I can't help showing you this. Buto, yes, I drink, but at least I don't drink the blood of the people. I think that's a fantastic quote. And then, of course, Zia ul Haq. And so, you know, the modern Pakistan, you know, crushing the bottles. And then a couple of images from Iran, including Arak Saki, you know, moonshine, and then the wine under the Shah, and then emptying bottles during the Iranian Revolution, and then smuggling alcohol, because of course, as we all know, drinking in Iran is quite widespread, including homemade alcohol, and especially in the fall, it's sometimes hard to get grapes because they're all bought up for private processing. And that's it. And thank you very much. Oh yes, I forgot to mention, and I'm sorry about that, I dedicated this book, the one that's making the rounds hopefully, to my beloved brother-in-law and Fariba's brother Mohammed, who sadly passed away 2 years ago.
I think I have the honor of drinking with him.
Yes.
Yes, we like drinking.
Well, thank you very much. That was jam-packed.
Yes.
There was a lot in there. We have to rush out, get your book, which is published by Oxford University Press, by the way, as I mentioned, available on Amazon, amazon.ca, and amazon.com.
And if I may add, at a reasonable price of about $35
US dollars.
US dollars,
Okay.
yeah. But for a hardback, that's
Yes,
a very
yes.
friendly price these days.
Absolutely. And with that beautiful cover. So can we have some questions? Sarah?
First of all, thank you very much. It was so exciting that it is actually. It's been to hear about this in your scholarship recently, everything about wine in Islamic world. I would like to know if you encountered any gender pattern within wine, and if yes, how do you compare it in different periods or different places, communities?
It's an excellent question, and I actually touch on that in the book because I'm aware of the gender issue, of course. Sadly, it's underreported and it's under-researched, and that includes my book. Well, I made an effort, quite frankly, but there are, so women do not fully take part in this theme, you know, drinking of alcohol. But they do appear in various periods and in various societies. They're part and parcel of sort of the Mongol impulse. You know, we know that the women were publicly active in Mongol times, and that includes drinking, and we have eyewitness reports of that. The Turco-Mongol tradition in general sort of foregrounds women far more than the traditional Islamic one. And again, that brings out women to some extent. We know about, in a number of instances, certainly in the Mughal period, which of course is an extension of the Turco-Mongol tradition, of women either behind the throne or as important participants in statecraft. I think I mentioned the wife of Jahangir as being a mitigating influence, but we also have examples, individual and somewhat intermittent examples of women participating in drinking and being engaged in it. But again, it's far less than one would wish to be able to talk about, unfortunately.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, my question was that what was the urge of using the...
A little louder.
Okay, sorry. What was the urge of using wine as an ecstasy, divine ecstasy in poetry of Persian literature, though it was clearly banned in Islam? You see, because in Rudi's poems, we cannot really see that much, but in Hafiz's poem, we see that they are connecting that to the divine ecstasy.
Yeah, it's a long and very intricate history, of course. First of all, the wine poem does not originate with Islam. It goes back to pre-Islamic times. So it's borrowed and transferred from pre-Islamic Arabia. And so there's a solid tradition upon which Islam builds. And then a couple of things involved, of course. First of all, wine is beautiful, to look at red wine especially. Sort of the goblet, the wine swilling around, the refraction of sunlight in the wine. So there's a whole world of metaphor to be explored there. And it is, of course, in poetry. But then wine also tastes good, and it brings you into a good mood. So it brings you closer to sort of kind of an ethereal level. The divine world opens up, if you will. So all that plays into it by way of metaphor. And then, of course, there is also the transgressive element. There's tension because it's forbidden in Islam, and yet there's a whole other world attached to it. So how do you reconcile the two? So that brings out creativity right there. And then, of course, there's the idea of protest and rebellion against the social order, against the oppressiveness of existence. We are young and we live it up, and then we're going to fade, and eventually we die. So, God, how can you have created a world like that, where this is our fate? And wine becomes a metaphor of rebellion against ultimately God himself. And it's not simply the Persian. There are Abu Nuwas, who of course sort of liminal Arab Persian, but he wrote in Arabic. And there are many Arab poets in the Abbasid period who follow the same kind of line and argumentation and kind of revolt against God and the universe, or at least against the restrictions imposed by Islam, the morality, the hypocrisy of the clerical leaders who drink themselves in the back room, and are engaged in moralism and ultimately hypocrisy. So that would be my short answer to the question. Sure.
That's a good answer to a very complicated question.
Yes, true.
Remember the earliest Persian poet like Rudaki. He's like this great line poem at a court. So, and then that gets into the mystical sphere. I think we have some online questions.
I can read them.
Let's just do one.
Sure. Puya A asks, very interesting talk. Were the shifting attitude against alcohol in Islamic countries like Turkey and Iran in the 20th century ever related to, or at least aware of, temperance and prohibition movement that were taking place in the U.S., Canada, and at the turn of the 20th century?
Good question.
And the answer is absolutely. Not so much in Iran, because there's never a concerted effort to prohibit alcohol. There's some haphazard measures taken during the Constitutional Revolution. It's really Reza Shah who tries but fails for all kinds of reasons. And again, what he does is mostly import substitution, right? Ban foreign imports and generate our own. Ottoman Empire is the place. Istanbul, Ankara, is a prohibition movement that is spearheaded by this Yeşilay movement, his Green Crescent movement, which in and of itself is created under the influence of American prohibitionism. There's the American Anti-Alcohol League that sends representatives that try to become global. So they have chapters in Egypt and Ottoman Empire. I'm not sure of anything in Iran. I've never seen a reference to that. It's not very successful, but it does light a spark. So there is a domestic element. And in 1920, with the Ottoman Empire on the ropes and the beginning of the emergence of the alternative republic, which sort of starts in Ankara, there is this attempt in the budding legislature to prohibit alcohol. It's mostly induced by the foreign presence in Istanbul, all these soldiers living it up and demolishing things. There are, riots and so forth. And they clearly not simply borrow from the American example, but they are in correspondence and they interact in terms of American articles in the American press being translated, and Americans also sort of communicating with this movement. And interestingly, even the clerics and Mehmed V, the last caliph, throwing his weight behind this movement with the argument that, listen, the up-and-coming empire in the world, the Americans, they have declared, or in the process of declaring, alcohol ban. We are Muslims. I mean, isn't alcohol forbidden in our religion? Shouldn't we follow suit? right? So there's an element of sort of bewilderment and shame involved. It doesn't last very long, but it is a fascinating episode. There's actually a book coming out like next month by Emine Everett at Michigan State University about precisely this episode. It's a wonderful book, so stay tuned for that.
Can I say something about Toronto? Since we're talking about prohibition and so on. All of you are probably too young to remember this. Maybe you weren't here either. So all of Western Toronto, the Junction area, was under the control of the Scottish Temperance Society. It was completely dry. You could not get a drink until, and I'm trying to think when Vesuvio's restaurant allowed alcohol. I think it was not before the 1980s.
Wow.
1980s. And now we have alcohol absolutely everywhere, even in corner shops, 7-Elevens. So it's like completely the reversal. And on top of that, of course, we had the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, where you had to kind of go into this building. There was no alcohol displayed, no bottles displayed. You had to sign a little chit. I know this because I would go with my father, and they would give you a bottle in a paper bag.
Right. And grim environment.
Grim environment, and now, of course, everything has exploded. So I just thought I would add that about our city here, too. You have a question, Karipa?
Yes, we know that during the reign of the Pahlavi dynasty, alcohol was served in the court, especially when they had foreign guests. But do you have any information about Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah? How much did they drink? Did they ever drink excessively like Saddam Hussein did, or other modern rulers in the Middle East?
I'm not even sure if Saddam Hussein drank. Saddam Hussein loved his, what is it called, the Portuguese rosé, that cheap stuff, Mateus rosé, these funny bottles, you know. But he's not known to have been a heavy drinker. Some of his people in his surroundings, his officers, yes. When it comes to Iran, Reza Shah is not known to have drunk, certainly not to excess. He's known, or at least suspected, to have been an opium user. Of course, one doesn't exclude the other necessarily, but as I pointed out, there were some attempts, mostly on the part of Sayyid Reza Tabatabai, his sidekick in the conspiracy that brought him to power in 21, who tried to ban alcohol. And for a while, it was certainly removed from the parliament. You know, he held these dour sessions where only orange juice and dour were being served. But there was nothing concerted or comprehensive in terms of restricting or let alone banning alcohol at the time. Now, when it comes to Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, there are some, well, you know, he was mostly friendly in terms of alcohol as kind of a capitalist enterprise. Very few restrictions, with a couple of exceptions. And it was outlawed in Qom and Mashhad in 1948. And then there was actually a discussion about the whole thing in the Mossadegh period, 1953. In February 53, the parliament decided to restrict, if not ban, alcohol. But then it ran up against economic crisis, which was already in the making at the time, right? And also there was some fear about Russia being a major vodka importing country. Didn't want to antagonize Russia or the Soviet Union. So the whole thing was postponed by 6 months. And then the coup came, and then the whole thing was never heard of again. The Shah himself drank, but moderately. You know, some glass, some champagne, glass, wine here and there, but nothing to excess.
Professor Mumtaz, question behind me.
Thank you for the talk. In fact, my question follows up on Maria's observation, which is the fact that, in fact, even in Christianity and kind of, you know, there are trends, but there are also sects and certain traditions that also are very prohibitive in terms of drinking. And so I feel like my question would be like, kind of in these narratives of taking Islam as prohibitive, but then we have to show that, in fact, people drank, it kind of makes these civilizational kind of parallels and kind of disjunctures between these, which these two kind of like, okay, these are the prohibited Muslims, in general don't drink, and I think this is part of the modern narrative in many ways. And so I feel like taking it kind of reproduces this narrative of Muslims as non-drinkers and then the Christians as drinkers. And I think the perhaps to me like very interesting things that I'm more interested in are some of the questions that was asked online about these interconnected histories rather that are also perhaps, for example, about imperialism, about trying to sell the need to kind of like what happened with China and drugs, or like not necessarily alcohol, but there's different projects about capitalism, about imperialism that were also intertwined. And I imagine earlier on there'd probably be more intertwined histories of these rather than separate ones. And I'd be curious if you think there's something to be true.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite sure. I mean, it's a big question you're posing, but I'd like to answer it this way. As of, say, the 19th century and progressing beyond that, we no longer can talk in these general terms about these empires with very vague contours. The Ottoman Empire, and then we have the Safavid Empire, and then followed by the Qajars, and Central Asia, different configuration, the Mughals, and so forth, until the British come in, and then North Africa, which is kind of fuzzy in a way, partly Ottoman, but then it sort of dissolves into Moroccan dynasties and so forth. All that dissolves in the course of the 19th and early 20th century, and we start talking about nation states, right, in embryonic nation states. So the whole discourse kind of shifts from generic and complementary to more specific and more individual, because we have specific sets of government policies that begin to play a role. But we also have, modern colonialism, and the most flagrant and the most conspicuous case is, of course, the French in North Africa, who simply declare Algeria an extension of France and treat it as such for 130 years, right? So how do they deal with alcohol? Well, alcohol was there, of course, but in very limited fashion. Under French influence, it spreads, but it comes also very much spatialized, because in France, in North Africa, we end up having the distinction between the ville arabe, the Arab traditional, the souk, surrounded by walls, Fez and Meknès and so forth on the one hand, and then the ville nouvelle, French-built, Mediterranean, wide sidewalks, palm trees, and débit, as they call them, the French, alcohol-selling establishments. So you get a rigid segregation, really. But then again, colonialism is a complex phenomenon, because the French aren't simply pushing alcohol. They know better than to push alcohol in an Islamic society and create enormous amount of resistance. So they make provisions not to allow alcohol to be sold within 200 yards of any mosque or school or educational establishment, to limit the number of licenses for alcohol purveying establishments within Muslim communities and so forth. And so there are all kinds of other restrictive measures following what they end up calling politique des égards. So, a politics of consideration with the prevailing culture. So it's a very complex question. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but we're limited in time, so yes.
Sorry, no, just a minute. We have one question here online.
I'm actually combining two questions. So
Sure.
The first question is regarding archaeological data, comparing it with written material and historical, whether they are compatible. And the second question, which is a long one, many thanks for the informative talk. By the way, a lot of people thank you for your wonderful talk. The speaker might be aware that Persian translation of his book, which is going to be one of the best sellers among the latest publications of Safavid Qajar in Iran.
Award-winning also.
Yes. So the question is regarding the drug culture, whether there is an interrelationship between wine and drug, because you mentioned also you have another book regarding the drug, and whether, this is my question as well, whether, for example, Shams Tabrizi talks about somebody comes and asks him, in Quran, khamr is forbidden by Sabzak, or hashish is not forbidden,
Right.
and then he gives an explanation of why is that.
Sure.
And whether somebody would circumvent alcohol by using drug, rather, some other kind of intoxication?
Yeah, well, the short answer to that one is that, and that's not just Iran, but Islam in general, and it also makes sense. And that is, since alcohol is forbidden, so as a pious Muslim, you don't drink. So hashish became sort of the alternative drug of choice, because there is no religious opprobrium attached to it. So there's kind of almost a seesaw relationship. And so they're used in combination in some cases, but that's on the part of those who just take anything that moves. And there are examples of that. And there are some indications that alcohol was consumed in so-called coffee houses at times, but it's more like kuknar and, more like the kind of drugs that we call drugs that are combined with, smoking and tobacco, for example, and opium. But by and large, they're two somewhat separate worlds, I would argue. But they're also alternative substances.
Were they competing with each other, basically?
Well, I don't know. I don't think they were competing in the sense that it depends. It's hard to tell because sometimes the documentation is not that clear. But we have certain areas within Iran, and certainly in the 19th century, where we know that alcohol was fairly widespread to very widespread. Hamadan, high percentage of Jewish population, right? Surroundings of Qazvin, there are lots of reports because, there are lots of vineyards around Qazvin, right? There are Armenians there, Shiraz, traditionally and stereotypically, of course, but also Khorasan, because the Kurds were known to be heavy drinkers. And Khorasan, especially Khocan, is ruled by a succession of Kurdish governors, who, of course, they all inherit their jobs from their fathers, and they're notorious boozers. There are a number of Westerners who go there, and they're confronted with people who are completely, out of it for days on end. They sleep until 4 p.m. because they engage in a boozing party every night, and it comes at the expense of good governance, and it's inherited from father to son. So again, you'd have to be a bit more specific when it comes to answering that type of question.
I think we should revisit that munazare, that is the competition poem, Bango Bade.
That's right.
Okay?
There's that.
Which one's better?
I had forgotten about that, and there's more than one. It's a bit of a genre. I don't necessarily. I mention it in the book, but I don't really get into the content of that. In other words, who wins?
Okay. I have a question back here, Professor Simichieva. We'll get to you. Don't worry, Professor Simichieva.
It's very small, actually. Is seyeki allowable?
Is what allowable?
Seyeki, when wine is
Oh, right, yeah. The what you call it? Yeah, you condense the alcohol to 1/3. What is it? There's thalatha involved. 3 in Arabic. What is the term again?
Seyeki or
Sulase. That's the term I know. By some is the answer. By some. It's one of the quote-unquote loopholes. Yes.
Okay, that's a good question. This gentleman, please.
It can be argued that some symbols are universal, whereas some others are culture-bound and space-bound. Concerning, the significance and the symbolic values and meanings of wine in the Islamic world, have you, made a comparison and contrast between the concept and the symbolic values of wine in the Islamic world with the other parts of the world, such as, for example, China or other areas?
No, I have not. That would be volume 2, I suppose, of the book.
Yeah, I know.
And well, I don't think I will write volume 2 because it's way beyond my ken. The Islamic world is big enough for me and already too big, as I pointed out. And I'm not sure. I'm sure it can be done fruitfully, but there's also a bit of an apples and oranges element involved, I think, because alcohol is so specifically present in Islam.
Yes.
As I point out here, in its presence, through absence, alcohol takes us to the heart of Islam, which is one of kind of the summing up arguments of my book. in no culture or civilization does it have that role, that sort of pronounced and
In Chinese poetry, for example, wine plays an important part as well. I mean, I believe that sort of comparison and contrast between, for example, the concept of wine in Chinese poetry and Persian poetry.
I'm sure that can be fruitfully done, but I don't know Chinese, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's the same kind of tension in Chinese culture between it being forbidden and yet being articulated that exists in Islam. So, but I'll leave it at that because, again,
Thanks,
I think it's an interesting question,
Thanks.
but I won't follow up myself.
It's
Thank
very,
you very
very
much.
interesting. I'm sure many volumes could follow.
Of course.
Not just drinking wine, but
Right.
what's more important, drinking wine or being drunk? So some cultures,
Sure.
just being drunk is
Right.
important. The
Right.
gentleman in the back.
Some short comments. One is assuming the Islamic pluralism make some of your findings straightforward.
So you have to raise your voice. I can't hear.
Yeah. I assuming the Islamic pluralism
Right.
make some of your findings straightforward. That there is so many ideas, some believe in,
Right.
something that okay, I'll call it that, I'll call it that. You can use it, you can produce it, you can use it as an economic instrument, and so on and so on. Maybe I just a comment. And second, the technology of ijtihad also for Daimanism case, the Islamic case, for example, from traditional to the modern. This also can, maybe some may have some impact on your...
Yeah, but that's precisely the instrument through which the discourse is being conducted by the clerics and by the exegetes. And, they came up with a plethora of answers, trying to find loopholes, or simply casuistic argumentation, which is in and of itself is a virtue in Islamic jurisprudence. But they always had to deal with and run up against this notion that khamr is forbidden in Islam, and the preponderance of evidence points against interdiction. And it's certainly it being makruh, meaning it's blameworthy. Maybe it's not totally forbidden, but it's certainly not something to be celebrated and to be indulged and to be proud of. So within those parameters, there was a very lively ijtihad type of discussion, absolutely.
I have a question
Until
back here,
today, by the
Mehdi.
way.
Yes, question back here.
First of all, many
Yes.
thanks for your talk, actually. I'm curious to know about Sufis wine drinking. Actually, how did they promote change? Actually, I know the Sufis, they were isolated people, lived in minority, but had disciples, had influence to some extent in their society. How did it change and promote wine consumption in
Well,
Iranian, particularly Iranian society under the Ilkhan?
Yeah, it's hard to tell because, I mean, we have no sources that get us into the social structure, or at least we have very few ones that would enable us to sort of locate Sufism and Sufis within the larger social societal construct, and much less talk about development over time. So, poetry is often, it's notoriously difficult to connect poetry to social circumstances. Write a biography of a Sufi, with exceptions, is not that easy. Certainly if you're just working with the poetry itself. So I don't have a good answer to the question, other than to say that Sufism was inherently part and parcel of society throughout time, in some parts of the Middle East in a more pronounced way than others. And Sufism, mysticism, and wine kind of go together for all kinds of reasons. So that twosome progresses in tandem throughout time until the 19th century, when Sufism, of course, never disappears, but in its traditional fashion, again, gets kind of subsumed under a new type of literature or new genres of literature. Because poetry is, of course, the ultimate expression of literature par excellence. But in the 19th century, we begin to have, sort of experimentation with short stories and ultimately the novel and so forth. Poetry. Also, I think the sort of the alcohol content, if it doesn't disappear, diminishes as part of the what carries forward poetry. So it's a bit of a vague answer, I admit, but I don't. It's the best I can give at this point.
We have another question. Are you
Yes.
okay?
Yeah, I'm fine.
More water
Sure.
for you?
No, it's all right. It's all right.
Spiked.
Yeah, well, that would be good.
Question at the back.
Thank you for your presentation. In Iran, there's this myth that Zakaria Razi discovered alcohol or ethanol, to be more exact. But as far as I know, he never distinguished ethanol in his research, but he did the experiment with distilling wine and observed that the fumes were flammable. I was curious, when is the earliest evidence of alcohol distillation in the Middle East for the purpose of drinking?
Right. It's a good question, and it's a bit shrouded in mystery. We think that it originated in the Middle East, and Razi is indeed always credited being the first one, but who knows? It definitely goes back, and it's of course not the invention of alcohol, it's distillation, right? Which produces then hard alcohol, so to speak, in all kinds of shapes and form. And then it migrates to Europe fairly quickly thereafter, but as far as we know, it did originate in the Middle East. But the precise timing beyond this emblematic figure remains open to discussion and perhaps new discovery.
You mentioned Georgia, and we have a project here in our department, connected with our department, which studies the earliest archaeological evidence in Georgia. It's called GRAPE. The Georgian Research, blah, 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 blah. I can't
should know
remember the
about
rest
that.
of it. But I'm sorry that Steve Batchuk, who's the head of that, isn't here. But they have a website.
Okay.
And they have excavations there. Every year they go in May and they
Check it out.
continue.
I will.
They found these big, you probably got one of those from their museum. I think that's.
Well, yes, that's the National
Yes,
Museum
the
of
big
in
hall.
Tbilisi.
Yeah,
Yes, yes, I took it there. That's true.
They go in May and May away.
Oh, right. Okay, May away. I see. Okay. A lot of wine in Georgia.
Any
it's true.
other questions? No? Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Okay. It's sort of some more of a historical question. So, this whole idea of Tobeh. So should I speak into this microphone? Yeah, okay. This guy who is depicted on your book cover, this ruler, his son was an alcoholic. And he was an alcoholic too. I mean, certified by our standard. The son was forced to make a public repentance at a court with all the court nobility and so on present. How do you read that?
Like who it was?
Mohsen Mirza.
Yes.
Yeah, Abu Mohsen Mirza. Yeah. So, how do you
Well,
read that?
it's
And
hard.
I'm sure it's not the first time that
No.
you would have this kind
Public
of
repentance.
performance
Right.
of
Yeah.
repentance from drinking.
Well, I can't answer the question without knowing about the ambiance, the context within which this occurred. But I'm not sure if I refer to instances like that in the book. But this kind of public performance sort of stands to reason because it can come in the face of a natural disaster or locust plague or an earthquake or something like that. All of which natural disasters, especially, were typically attributed to minorities, and then the mob was let loose on Armenian liquor stores, so to speak. But you do have these rulers engaged in public repentance Well, it varies in terms of circumstance, but it's of course very powerful and performative because it's coming in line with God's, the world as ordered and as ordained by God. But again, a specific and precise answer I can't give because it all depends on in what circumstances this took place.
I think Babur as well. I think he had
of course, he is
I don't
Tobeh.
know what the sort of what the setting was for that, but it was public. in
Yes,
some way.
that's very true. That's right. But he falls off the wagon again at some point.
True. Okay, one more question from online. Is
yes.
that okay?
In the 19th century, senior clerics were often also Sufi sheikhs in Egypt and elsewhere, and were instrumental in the emergence of Salafism. Were these Sufis also engaged in wine drinking culture?
The answer is I don't know. I just have to be honest about it. I have not encountered that element, that part, any evidence for that, so I don't have an answer to that.
Okay, I think we have exhausted questions, so it remains for me to thank you very much for a very engaging presentation, lecture. We're all going to rush out and buy your book, and thank you for your attendance and for your questions.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor. Very much. Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.
And